This is Ghosts of WWII, where memory is sacred and the echoes of war still whisper through the trees. If you remember the stories or carry the name of someone who fought, subscribe and share their name in the comments below. Some heroes wore no medals. They wore mud and silence. They mocked them at first, not just the Japanese, but sometimes even their own commanders. Too small, some said. Too green. They weren't traditional Marines, not the kind that landed en masse with tanks behind them and warships offshore. These were something new, born out of desperation and innovation. They were called the Marine Raiders, and in 1942, no one knew quite what to make of them. The idea was simple. Create elite units capable of striking fast, hitting hard, and disappearing before the enemy could react. Units that didn't need landing craft or artillery support, just a target, a compass, and a knife. But the execution was anything but simple. Training was brutal. Sleep was rare. Rations were minimal. And the jungles they would enter were nothing like the books. The Japanese called Guadalcanal the Island of Death. They had every reason to. The terrain devoured men. Jungle so dense it blocked out the sun insects thick enough to choke your throat. Every footstep a risk, every shadow a threat. When the raiders landed at Tulagi in August 1942, few expected much. The Japanese certainly didn't. They were seasoned, dug in, and certain that no American force would dare challenge them with such a small number of men. But the raiders weren't there to challenge. They were there to dismantle. They came ashore in silence. No battle cry, no fanfare, just 30-odd men crawling through roots and shadows. Their faces were streaked with mud and mosquito bites. Their boots were soaked. Their packs carried little more than a few grenades, ammo, and a bayonet apiece. Their orders were clear. Take out the command post. No extended firefights. No pitched battles. Just precision. What followed was not a traditional engagement. It was a ghost war. They struck without warning, slipped between tents, pulled triggers once, maybe twice, then vanished. The Japanese, trained for brutal frontal assaults and bayonet rushes, didn't know how to respond. Gunfire erupted, but it was wild, directionless. They fired into trees, into fog, into the silence. When dawn broke, the Japanese command post was gone. Nothing left but ashes and bodies. The raiders had lost men, but they'd left a message. This war wouldn't be fought by the old rules. The Marine Raiders didn't win through strength. They won through speed. They moved with purpose, never lingering, never visible, and they struck when the enemy least expected it. Over the next year, the Raiders became a whisper in the Pacific. They attacked outposts in the dead of night, slipping ashore on rubber boats or swimming the last stretch with weapons held high. They hiked for days without speaking. Ate rice scavenged from enemy stores, used palm leaves to bandage wounds, and they kept coming. One raid involved crawling through 2 miles of swamp to reach a Japanese radio tower. Another saw a dozen men take a hill with nothing but knives and grenades. They fought uphill, barefoot, their boots lost in the muck. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked like ghosts. By the time word reached Tokyo, the myth had already started to form. Japanese soldiers called them demons. American troops called them crazy. But those who fought beside them, they called them brothers. Then came Choiseul, October 1943. The plan, if you could call it that, bordered on madness. Drop just under 100 raiders behind enemy lines on a heavily fortified Japanese island, not to take territory, not to hold ground, just to make noise. A diversion, meant to pull Japanese forces away from the larger Allied invasion of Bougainville. The raiders landed quietly, dug in fast, and then unleashed hell. They hit everything. Patrols, fuel depots, ammo stores, outposts. They fought in short bursts, fired and faded, Never in the same place twice, the Japanese believed an entire Marine division had landed. Tokyo Rose reported thousands of Marines storming Choiseul. She had no idea it was just 90 men. By the time extraction came, a third of the raiders were dead or wounded. But the island burned behind them. The Japanese had been fooled, reinforcements had been pulled. Bougainville landed smoother because of it. The price was blood, but the value was time. They weren't mocked after that. The raiders didn't seek recognition. Many of them never talked about what they did. Some refused to, some couldn't. But those who knew, knew. Because they were there, they remembered crawling through jungle so loud with insects it drowned out your thoughts. They remembered watching a buddy bleed out into the soil, whispering not to scream. They remembered the heat, the weight, the silence. The war would grow larger. The Marines would shift toward mass amphibious assaults, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and beyond. But for a short, brutal stretch of time, a small group of men carved a new kind of warfare into the mud and memory of the Pacific. They were the first to strike and the last to speak. This is Ghosts of World War II. If you remember their names, carry them forward. Subscribe, comment, and return for the stories that still echo in the trees. Because some ghosts never left the jungle. The jungle did not care who you were. It didn't matter if you were a general or a private, a raider or a cook. In the Pacific, the jungle was the only authority. It choked you, blinded you, stripped you down to raw instinct, and if you couldn't move through it, if you couldn't respect it, it killed you just as fast as the enemy would. But the Marine raiders learned to move with it. They didn't fight the jungle. They listened to it. It told them when to stop, when to strike, when to vanish. And in doing so, they became invisible. By late 1943, raider units were operating across dozens of islands: Bougainville, Vangunu, New Georgia, and more. Their footprints barely registered, but their impact rang out across the entire theater. What made them different wasn't just their mission profile, it was how they fought. The average raider carried half the load of a regular infantryman. He moved faster, slept less, and trained in techniques most Marines never touched. Silent movement, close quarters knife work, mapeless navigation demolition with minimal supplies. These weren't textbook soldiers, they were improvisers. At Vella La Vella, that improvisation was tested. An army unit had gotten stranded after a failed advance, surrounded by Japanese forces. There was no easy route in, certainly no way out. Command was hesitant to act. But the raiders volunteered without being asked. A single company was inserted behind Japanese lines in a night drop. There were no clear maps, no trails, just the wet green hell of the jungle and the distant sound of enemy gunfire. They moved quietly. For 2 days they cut a path, not through the trees, but through fear. And when they reached the army survivors, they didn't hesitate, they didn't sleep, they didn't eat. They simply turned around and started pulling men back one by one. By the time they reached the extraction zone, over 600 soldiers had been pulled out. Not carried, not dragged, led, one at a time. It wasn't a rescue, it was a retrieval. Raiders didn't leave people behind, but not every mission ended in triumph. On Bougainville, a raider patrol was ambushed while setting demolition charges at an enemy airstrip. Trapped, low on ammo, and with no way to signal, they dug into the earth and waited. For 48 hours they held that line, not to win, but to hold long enough for the others to escape. Only 5 men survived. They made it back with 1 rifle between them, 1 dog tag missing, and no supplies. When asked what happened, the sergeant simply said, "They didn't pass us." Those stories never made the newspapers. They didn't appear in newsreels or on radio broadcasts. They were told in whispers, across campfires and foxholes, passed from one generation to the next, if at all. That was the way of the raiders. No parade, no announcement, just a job done, and then on to the next one. By early 1944, their effectiveness had started to ripple upward. Officers across the Pacific Theater were requesting Raider support, not for large-scale engagements, but for precision work cutting a comms line before a landing, disrupting enemy fuel before a bombing run, making sure a sniper nest disappeared before dawn. They were ghosts with a task list, and yet for all their value, there was a growing tension inside the brass. The Marine Corps was expanding rapidly. The war was shifting. Battles were growing larger, more industrial. Whole islands needed to be taken in weeks, thousands of men, dozens of ships, massive coordination. And in that environment, the Raiders were becoming harder to place. Their teams were small, their methods unorthodox. They didn't work well with rigid chains of command. They needed flexibility, secrecy, autonomy. And to some in high command, that looked a lot like chaos. Some began to question their necessity. Why train men for raids, they said, when we can send divisions to take the whole island? But war is never one-dimensional, and some victories can only be won in the dark. That became clear during a joint operation in the Philippines. A Raider detachment teamed up with local guerrilla fighters to sabotage Japanese ammunition trains deep in the jungle. For 3 weeks, they lived among villagers, posed as fishermen, and learned the terrain. When the time came, they struck hard and vanished faster. 5 trains were destroyed, 2 bridges collapsed. Japanese movements slowed to a crawl, all without a single American casualty. The mission was never officially acknowledged, but those who were there knew what had happened. They'd watched the jungle burn from a mile away, heard the distant thunder, felt the satisfaction of doing something small that meant something big. Not long after, the decision came down. The Raider battalions would be deactivated. Some were furious. Others accepted it quietly. Most were simply tired. It was not a punishment. It was logistics. The war had changed. What was needed now was mass, not knives in the dark. But the impact remained. Raider tactics were absorbed into the broader Marine doctrine. Their training methods became standard. Their legacy passed on, not in names, but in methods. In 1947, President Truman formally acknowledged their contribution. Success in the Pacific, he said, owed more to the quiet courage of small units than to the thunder of artillery. Today, their insignia is rare. Their stories rarer still. But they are not gone. The Raiders became the blueprint for what would come after. The SEALs, the Force Recon Units, the Special Operations Groups that still operate in the shadows. Their legacy lives in every mission that begins with a whisper and ends with silence. And for those who fought beside them, who watched them walk into the jungle and not return, they were more than Marines. They were the kind of men who never asked to be remembered, which is why we must. This is Ghosts of World War II. If you're still with us, subscribe. Leave a name in the comments, a friend, a father, a brother. Because if we stop saying them out loud, who will? There's a moment in every war where silence becomes louder than gunfire. For the Raiders, that moment came not in the jungle, but after it. In the weeks and months following their deactivation, a strange quiet set in. Men who had once operated in the deepest shadows were now folded into regular infantry units. Their patches were replaced, their unit names scratched off rosters. To the larger war machine, it was progress. To them, it felt like a funeral without a flag. But their work had not gone unnoticed. Throughout the Pacific, commanders had begun shaping their operations around what the Raiders had proved possible. Amphibious landings were now preceded by fast, targeted strikes. Forward observers began moving in smaller teams, borrowing movement tactics learned from Raider squads. Night raids became not just an option, but a standard. And perhaps more importantly, something began to shift in the mindset of American leadership. The belief that a small group of highly trained men could alter the course of a much larger campaign was no longer a fantasy. It had happened, over and over. Their impact could be measured not just in Japanese casualties or infrastructure destroyed, but in time bought, time for major landings, time for airfields to be secured, time for hundreds of men to escape a fight they would have lost. But not everyone measured impact in charts. Some measured it in names never spoken aloud again. There was Corporal Jim Ortega, quiet kid from Arizona who walked point in Vangunu. They say he never blinked, not once. Until he walked straight into a sniper's line during an extraction, his squad made it out. He didn't. No one ever found his tags. Then there was Lieutenant Dan Clay, the one they called the priest, because he always carried a Bible in his pocket and whispered a prayer before every op. He died in a river crossing in New Georgia, carrying another man who couldn't swim. They buried what was left of him under a tree marked with his initials, carved with a bayonet. The war rolled on. Okinawa, Iwo Jima, the Philippines. The battles grew larger, more brutal, more mechanical, but here and there, in the margins of after-action reports, you could still see the fingerprints of the raiders. Flanking maneuver used, similar to pre-landing sabotage units. Enemy artillery weakened after targeted night infiltration. High success rate on silent approach suggested prior training. The brass didn't call them raiders anymore, but the ghosts were still working. Meanwhile, the men themselves tried to adapt. Some struggled with the transition. They'd been used to moving in tight groups, 4, 6, maybe 10. Now they were part of platoons with radio calls and structured orders, no room for improvisation, no slipping off into the trees to deal with something quietly. One raider, now reassigned to a mechanized infantry unit, was written up for leaving his post to scout a ridge on his own initiative. He returned with coordinates for a Japanese machine gun nest that had been pinning them down for hours. But the reprimand stuck, and he stopped volunteering after that. Others tried to find meaning in the shift. They carried raider habits with them, always sitting with their backs to a wall, cleaning weapons twice a day, rationing even when food was plentiful, and always walking a perimeter, even when the camp was secure. Old habits didn't die. They just went silent. In the United States, families received telegrams with names they hadn't heard in months. Killed in action. Missing in action. Wounded in combat. Some of those names belonged to men who'd once fought on Choiseul or Tulagi or Vella La Vella. But those places weren't listed. The official records simply stated Pacific Theater. The full stories lived only in letters, and even those grew sparse. A letter from Sergeant Lee Abrams to his brother in Ohio read, "We're not called Raiders anymore, just Marines. Same uniform, different weight. Feels like someone took the teeth out of a dog and told it to bark louder, but we keep moving. That's what we do. We move." His brother never got to read the second letter. Lee was killed during a mop-up operation in Leyte, shot while pulling a wounded soldier from a bunker. By 1945, the original Raider battalions were officially dissolved, their numbers scattered across the Corps. But the men still found each other, in mess halls, on ships, in hospital tents. They recognized the walk, the way someone held their weapon, the way they moved through doorways, always low and left. And sometimes late at night they told stories, not of glory, not of kills, but of silence. The kind of silence you only hear after a knife strike in a dark jungle. The kind that stays with you for decades. After the war, many of them disappeared back into civilian life. Some became police officers, others worked docks, farms, or fire departments. Some drank. A few never stopped running, but a handful kept in touch. In 1957, a small group of former raiders gathered at a VFW hall in New Orleans. They brought their families, some photos, and a few mementos, patches, maps, even an old kabar wrapped in oilcloth. They drank to the ones who didn't come home. And then, someone stood up and said what had been sitting unspoken for over a decade. We were never meant to last, but we made sure someone else could. That became a motto of sorts. It wasn't official. No one put it on a banner. But those words passed from one old raider to another. And when the Marine Corps finally reactivated the Raider name in 2014 for its Elite Special Operations Command, those words returned. You can see them in the eyes of the modern raiders. You can hear them in the training grounds, in the silence between explosions, in the boots stomping through a new kind of jungle. The legacy didn't die, it just waited. And now, it's remembered. Here at Ghosts of WWII, we don't let stories fade. We gather the whispers and make them heard again. Subscribe, comment, tell us who you remember. Because silence deserves to be broken, when it honors the ones who fought in it. By the time the guns fell silent in 1945, most of the world celebrated. Flags were raised, streets were filled, the radio played songs of victory. But for the men who had fought in the shadows, the end of the war didn't sound like music. It sounded like a whisper too faint to hear. The Marine Raiders, those who had survived, came home to a country that didn't quite know what to do with them. There were no ticker tape parades for the men who didn't wear unit patches anymore, no books written about raids that had never officially happened, no speeches for the men who fought under moonlight, then vanished by dawn. And yet they carried something with them, something heavier than the packs they wore through the jungle. It wasn't pride, it wasn't trauma, though many bore that too. It was something quieter, a kind of unfinished story. You see, the Raider legacy was never meant to be about recognition. It wasn't about medals or rank. It was about effectiveness, precision brotherhood. They weren't created to last forever. They were created to fill a need, a hole in the middle of the Pacific that only fast, quiet, deadly action could fill. And they filled it. But that legacy doesn't rest easy, especially not for the men who lived it. Many of them struggled in the years after the war. Raider veterans had trained for silence, but civilian life asked them to talk about jobs, about families, about the future. Some adapted, others drifted, and a few simply disappeared, moving from town to town, working under aliases, never speaking of where they'd been or what they'd done. At reunions, they'd reappear, older, thinner, but not broken. In 1962, a gathering of Raider vets met in Los Angeles. They didn't bring fanfare, just folded photos, worn letters, and a lot of silence. One man stood and said, "I still dream in green, but it's not nightmares, it's memory." They nodded, because they all knew what that meant. Their legacy, though unofficial for decades, began to surface in the stories told around kitchen tables and VFW halls. Sons and grandsons began asking questions. What was it like? What did you do? And more often than not, the answers were short. We did what we had to. We were just Marines. We walked through the jungle and came home. But slowly books began to appear. Historians started to dig. Old reports once buried in wartime archives were unsealed. And the full picture of the Raider operations, the planning, the danger, the sheer guts, began to emerge. They weren't just behind-the-lines troops. They were innovators, pioneers of a new kind of warfare. Tulagi, Makin Choiseul. These names, once only known to those who lived them, now appeared in military textbooks. Raiders were studied not as a fluke experiment, but as the origin story of something much larger, the modern Special Operations Force. It's easy to look back now and draw a line, from the Raider battalions of 1942 to the elite units of today. But in those days, that line was blurry. For decades, the Marine Corps didn't speak of the Raiders with much formality. They'd been dissolved, absorbed, forgotten by paperwork if not by memory, until something changed. In the early 2000s, as modern warfare shifted again toward counterinsurgency, asymmetric threats, and surgical strikes, the military began looking back, asking who had done this before, who had the blueprint. And every time, the trail led to the Raiders. In 2014, the Marine Corps officially reactivated the Raider name, not as a tribute, not as nostalgia, but as necessity. They needed elite units that could do what no one else could, and they didn't need to invent a name for it. They already had one. Marine Special Operations Command, MARSOC, adopted the Raider title and insignia. The eagle, globe, and anchor were joined once more by a dagger and a flash of lightning. To the surviving World War II Raiders, many now in their 90s, the moment was powerful. The name had returned. But more than that, the mission had endured. Some attended the reactivation ceremony. They sat in wheelchairs, wore caps with frayed patches, and watched a new generation of young men pledged to carry the torch forward. A former Raider, now well into his 90s, was asked what it meant to him. He said, "It means they remember, that it wasn't for nothing, that we're not ghosts anymore." But here at Ghosts of WWII, we know they always mattered, because history has a way of forgetting the quiet ones, the men who moved without fanfare, who risked everything without expectation, who never asked for a statue. But we don't forget, and neither should you, because in the whispers of jungle leaves, in the grainy black and white photos, in the yellowed letters and creased dog tags, the story still lives. It's in the way modern special forces move today. The emphasis on speed, stealth, and precision, the unity of small teams, the refusal to quit. These principles didn't start in Iraq or Afghanistan. They started on a beach in Tulagi, in a swamp in New Georgia, in the silence of Choiseul. Every time a team infiltrates under cover of darkness, every time a mission is executed with surgical accuracy, the Raiders are there. Their blood is in the roots. Their memory, if we protect it, will never fade. This isn't just history. It's inheritance. You, listening now, might carry that inheritance in your name, in a photo tucked in a drawer, in a folded flag in the attic. Maybe your grandfather never spoke of the war. Maybe your father told stories only after 2 drinks. Maybe you never understood why the man at the table always sat with his back to the wall. Now you know, and it's your job to carry it forward. Here at Ghosts of WWII, we believe memory is a duty, and we fulfill it not just with stories, but with reverence. So subscribe. Share your story in the comments. Tell us about the Raider you knew, or the one you wish you had. Because their story didn't end in 1944, or 45, or even today. Their story continues, as long as someone keeps telling it. Time is a strange thing. For the Raiders who returned, it moved differently. The years passed, children grew, the world changed. But inside, for many, part of them never left the jungle. The mud never washed out completely. The silence they lived with on those islands became a part of them. And though they rarely spoke of it, others could feel it. The Marine Raiders were a small brotherhood. You could live in another state, never cross paths with one for decades. But when you did, it was as if no time had passed. One handshake, one glance, and you both knew. You'd seen the same darkness, felt the same heat, heard the same terrible holy silence before a knife strike. It connected them deeper than blood. In the decades after the war, they formed associations, not to glorify, but to remember. They held reunions in VFW halls, American Legion posts, even backyards. They brought their wives, their sons, and eventually their grandsons. But what mattered most were the men in the room who remembered Tulagi, Choiseul, New Georgia, not from books, but from the stench of death and gunpowder. At one such gathering in 1971, a raider named Joseph Haskins stood before a room of nearly 100 old comrades. Some were missing limbs, some sat in wheelchairs, some had cancer in their lungs from decades of silence and cigarettes, but all were present in spirit. He stood and said, "We never asked to be remembered, but we never wanted to be erased." The room fell silent, not out of solemnity, but respect, because every man there knew the world had already begun to forget. The kids learned about Iwo Jima, about Normandy, about Eisenhower and MacArthur, but few knew about the shadows that came before the spotlight. Few knew what it meant to move in six-man teams, to swim a mile in the dark with a knife clenched in your teeth, to watch your best friend vanish in jungle mist and never return. And yet those stories mattered, because they filled in the blanks history left behind. So the raiders told them, not to brag, but to preserve. One grandson, a boy of 14, stood up at a reunion and said, "I never knew my grandpa was a hero. I thought he just fixed cars." Another read his grandfather's diary aloud, a single page that simply said, "We left 4 behind tonight. We didn't talk about it, just kept walking. I kept seeing Jimmy's eyes in the dark. I think he forgave me." That page was folded and yellowed, but it hit harder than any metal. The 1980s brought documentaries, renewed interest in World War II history, and finally, some official recognition. Raider units began to be mentioned again in training manuals. A few surviving members were interviewed on television. One segment featured a 92-year-old raider holding up his original K-bar and saying, "It didn't look like much, but it never let me down." That knife is now in a museum. But most of the stories, still in basements, attics, shoeboxes, and that's where Ghosts of World War II comes in. We exist to bring those stories back to light, to make sure no whisper goes unheard, because for every famous battle, there are 10 that were never recorded. For every hero we celebrate, there are 50 more whose names were lost to mud and time. And yet they mattered, especially to the men who walked beside them. You'd hear it sometimes in the way they paused before answering a question, that far-off look, like they were watching something you couldn't see, a memory that had weight. One raider was once asked, "How did you survive?" He answered, "I didn't. I just never died." That's the kind of answer only someone who's been through it can give. And as the years wore on, fewer and fewer were left to answer. The Raider Association, once several hundred strong, began to shrink. At their 2005 reunion, only 27 members remained. Still sharp, still proud, but slower now. Many walked with canes. Some needed help standing for the national anthem. But every man stood. In 2010, one of the last original Raiders passed away in his sleep. He had kept his uniform in the closet until the day he died. His grandson found a folded note in the breast pocket that read, "Tell the truth, we were scared, but we did it anyway." That's what courage is. It's not bravado or arrogance. It's fear, harnessed with purpose. The Raiders had it in spades, and when the Marine Corps reactivated the Raider name in 2014, something incredible happened. Modern Raiders, young and fit and forged in a new kind of war, began visiting the old guard. They sat with men in VA hospitals. They listened, took notes, cried, laughed. And in doing so, they reconnected a lineage that had once been severed. One World War II Raider, near the end of his life, was pinned with the new insignia by an active duty Marine. He wept, not for the war, not for the friends he'd lost, but because the torch had not been dropped. It had been passed. And so here we are, carrying that torch in words, in stories, in videos, watched by millions who never knew the names but now feel the weight. Because if you're reading this, if you've made it this far, then the silence has not swallowed them completely. They still live, in memory, in myth, in mission. And with your help, they always will. This is Ghosts of WWII. If a raider lived in your family, tell us. If you served beside one, tell us. If this story stirred something in you, something old, something sacred, subscribe, comment. Say their names out loud, because silence forgets. But we do not. There comes a point in every war story where the bullets stop, the smoke clears, and only the memory remains. But not every memory survives. Some get lost in paperwork, some vanish in the mouths of men too haunted to speak, and some, the rarest, live on not because they were written, but because someone cared enough to remember. The Marine Raiders never asked for statues. They never wanted monuments. They only wanted to do their job and bring their brothers home. In many cases they did. In too many others, they didn't. And that's why stories like this matter. They matter because time forgets what doesn't shout, because the world moves too fast to hear whispers, because someday someone will walk past a name carved in stone and ask, "Who was that?" And we must have an answer. We must say, he was one of the quiet ones, the ones who moved at night, who struck fast and left faster, who risked everything, not for glory, but because someone had to. We must say he was a raider, and that meant something. It still does. The legacy they left behind is not just in tactics or weapons, it's in mindset, a way of thinking, a belief that small teams, acting with purpose and precision, can change the course of history. That belief still lives. In the jungles of the Pacific, some of their gear still rusts beneath the vines. Helmets, dog tags, rusted blades. Nature reclaims all things, but memory resists. And now, so must we. Because the youngest of the original raiders, those 18-year-olds who slipped through Japanese lines with knives in their teeth, would now be over 100. Few remain. Most have joined the ghost they once fought beside, and yet, when we speak their stories, they return. Each time we say Tulagi or Choiseul or Vela la Vela, we raise the dead, not to glorify war, but to honor sacrifice, to make sure courage does not die in the dirt. That is the mission now. You and I are part of it. If you've listened to all 6 parts of this story, then you've done something rare. You've taken time to sit with history, to respect it, to feel its weight. You've let silence speak. And now, it's your turn to speak back. If you carry the name of a raider, say it in the comments. If your grandfather served in the Pacific, tell us where. If you're part of the new generation wearing that raider patch, let us know you're out there. Because Ghosts of World War II isn't just a channel, it's a lighthouse. It shines back through time to illuminate the men who once moved in darkness, to call them by name, to make sure they are not forgotten, not by the wind, not by the jungle, not by the blur of time. And that's why we end this story not with a battle, but with a vow. We vow to remember. We vow to listen. We vow to say their names when the world falls quiet. Because when they were mocked, they stood tall. Because when they were sent to die, they changed the tide. Because when they were erased from rosters, they carved their legend into the roots of history. They were the Marine Raiders. And now, they are ours to carry. So carry them well. Subscribe to Ghosts of World War II. Tell their story. Share their legacy. And when someone asks why you care, you look them in the eye and say, because they mattered. And they still do.